Hey, welcome back to the Flex Diet Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Mike T. Nelson. On this podcast, we talk about all things to increase performance and add some muscle, improve body composition, and do it all within a flexible framework without destroying your health. Today on the program, we've got Dr. Allan Bacon. You probably may have recognized him from online. He is an online trainer living in Maui, Hawaii right now. So we talk a little bit about that. He actually has a doctorate in dental surgery from the University of Maryland and now does fitness stuff full time. He's done formulations in the past. Just a real wealth of training knowledge all around. And we had a great conversation about everything from how heavy should you train? Should you train to failure? What are the pros and cons of different movements? Should you do a warm-up? What type of warm-up might be most beneficial? Muscle soreness, or commonly called DOM, this delayed onset muscle soreness. And just a really good training discussion with lots of other sidebars here and there for almost an hour and a half. And in reality, I probably could have talked to him even longer than that. He will be presenting next year at the Coaches Summit in Vegas. So I will be there attending. I hope to see some of you there. And yeah, so just enjoy this wide-ranging conversation with Dr. Allan Bacon. And if you liked this podcast, you want to listen to more podcasts I have, or get on to the daily newsletter for a lot more on my website, which is miketnelson.com/podcast. And that'll give you a listing of all the podcasts I've been on. It'll give you a listing of the current ones, past ones, and there'll be a place where you can get onto the daily newsletter for even more great information delivered right to your inbox. So enjoy this conversation with my buddy, Dr. Allan Bacon. Thank you so much for listening to the podcast.
Dr. Mike, the man, the myth, the legend.
Yeah, something like that. I've heard worse.
How are you doing?
I'm good. Sure. How are you?
Doing all right.
I just thought we'd talk about a little bit about your journey and if there's any fitness myths that kind of bother you. So that was the topic I was thinking about.
There's tons of different fitness myths. I actually think I had a paper somewhere around here where I was talking about some. There are tons of different fitness myths that we can get into. I know that I've seen on some of your previous ones, you like talking about supplements and stuff like that. And I formulated professionally for the dietary supplement industry for 15 years. The other thing that I was thinking about talking about was for the trainees that listen to your podcast. One of the things that I found that's a common issue with the people that I train or the people that I coach, do you still actively coach people, or are you sticking mainly to research? And
I still coach people. I've cut down on the number. Like
Sure.
right after COVID, I took the highest amount of people I've ever had. And I want to say at one point I had 25, 26, somewhere around there. Because I was super afraid, because most people I have are trainers, like probably 2/3 of them are. And so I was afraid their gyms are getting shut down. I'm like, they're going to cancel me. So anyone who was interested that I felt like was a good fit, I'm like, yeah, sure.
Just take them on now. Yeah.
And then everybody stayed, which was great.
Yeah.
So I let it drop down to, I only have 13 now. So I keep it around 12.
So one of the other things that was interesting to me, and I don't mind taking the conversations in any direction that you want to go, because I love talking about a large variety of things with supplements, nutrition, fitness, mindset, that stuff. The other thing that I was thinking about was people have a real hard time, and this is something that I've noticed with a lot of my clients. People have a real hard time of understanding the idea of pushing past discomfort to really hit that level of adaptation that you're trying to achieve to build lean muscle, because everybody comes to you and they'll say, I want to lose fat. And almost everyone that says that also says, I want to build some lean muscle. If it's the women, they're saying, I want to get toned. If it's men, they just want to build muscle. And particularly for Gen Pop, I find that very few of them are actually lifting heavy enough to get much of a change outside of that beginner phase. In that beginning phase, you can literally do anything and it always works. But outside of that, it really starts to take dialing in your intensity. And that's when nutrition and all that stuff falls into play. But what I was really thinking about was, what are we seeing with athletes and clients as they're moving out of that beginner phase and a more immediate and hopefully eventually into that advanced phase. As far as, are you really pushing intensity, and is this maybe one of the major hangups that we're facing, and how do we address this?
Yeah, let's just start there and dig into it. I record an intro, outro later, so we're good to go. Yeah, so we all know that people who are just lifting, you could lift soup cans and probably get stronger. But what do you do after that sort of newbie gains wear off? But let's say you're 3 to 6 months into it. What do you find is a common mistake that people make at that point?
I usually find for about the first year, like you were saying, those newbie gains tend to accumulate maybe over a year or so. Those neural adaptations, like you're talking about, are really quick in those first few months, and then newbie gains tend to continue for a little while. And I think that people fall into a trap of thinking, okay, the level of effort that I'm giving here is sufficient because I'm seeing progress and this is great. And they don't really realize that to progress once you get into that intermediate stage and beyond is really something that you have to develop mental toughness and embrace that discomfort that truly bringing adaptation requires. And I'm sure that you're familiar with the research on training towards failure and hypertrophy, and how
Stu
close
Phillips, Nick Bird, and
right,
a lot of those
absolutely.
guys were the
Schoenfeld
original
starts to
people
look,
who did that.
and how the more data that comes out, the more that we see that roughly after the beginner stage, it's about, the closer to failure you are, typically the better per set. As long as you're also adjusting for fatigue and your recoverability. So usually for most people, getting between 1 to 2 reps in reserve or so after that beginner stage is probably a good guideline. Would you agree?
I would generally agree.
You can disagree
yes.
if you want.
No, I would say that the caveat I would add, which I'm sure you'll get into, is I will generally only program that for more isolation exercises. So like the leading exercise, if I'm doing a bench press or trap bar deadlift or squat or something like that. With newer people, especially online, in person is a little bit different. I don't trust them for a while until I can see a fair amount of videos. So I tend to go like a 2 or 3 hour yard, and I tend to be more conservative on that. And then as it gets into more accessory isolation stuff, it's how bad are you really going to mess up a preacher curl?
So you're saying from an injury risk standpoint,
from a risk reward standpoint,
sure,
yeah.
And that's completely fine. I would agree with that there.
That was my hesitation.
Yeah, no, that's fine. And I think that this is when we're talking about getting into that 1 to 2 RIR type range, we're talking about being a little bit more experienced than a rote beginner. And so hopefully let's assume that we've got decent form down. And so we're moving past that stage where we really have to be with a little bit more nuance, like you're talking about, because what you're saying is 100% on point, and I agree with that. And particularly when you're working with newer trainees, a lot of the times I would say push until you really start to feel challenged. And maybe we don't even worry about that RIR, because what we're trying to do is we're trying to build that consistency with getting into the gym, getting them used to that type of movement patterns and getting their form down. So what you're saying really makes sense. As people become more proficient with the way that they move, then maybe we get a little bit more tighter with those reps and reserve ranges that we give people. And it's interesting when we look at where people are getting caught, because there's a lot of research on this stuff. Like Steele looked at it in 2017, Barbosa Neto looked at it in 2017. And whether you are standardizing the weight and then having them go to a certain number of reps failure, or standardizing the reps and having them choose the weight to reach it, people tend to be significantly off.
They tend to be way off.
Yeah, even competitive people have a tendency to underestimate their ability by about 3 to 5 reps from momentary muscular failure. Right? And in some cases, when you look at people that are not competitive and that are journeyman type trainees, are these people that have been doing it in their homes and want to do it for physique and health and all those overall purposes. Sometimes the error selection can be off by, if you're standardizing reps and you say, okay, you pick the weight, and then you ask them to take that to momentary muscular failure, they can be off by upwards of 11 reps. That's what Barbosa Neto found. And it's often found that people are attempting loads where they are able to do double their intended reps. And this only gets worse the more reps that you tend to do. And I think that a lot of the reason that people do this is because they feel like if they're doing significantly more reps, it induces that higher degree of discomfort. And so it reinforces that idea that they really need to feel uncomfortable when they're lifting, rather than instead actually getting the intensity where they need to be and hitting that 1 to 2 RIR and probably progressing better with less overall soreness.
And you're
so
talking about acute discomfort, not
acute,
delayed
yes,
onset muscle soreness, discomfort after the session, right? You're talking about during the session, correct?
during the session, although acute, like delayed onset muscle soreness is probably more significant from higher reps than it is from hitting lower reps with more intensity anyways. Wouldn't you agree?
Ooh, I'd say that.
Especially with
I
more
think it would
eccentric work.
depend on what you're not accustomed to. If I had to
Sure.
give a one sentence answer, but yeah.
Sure. So we have to find a starting point. And we have two issues at play, regardless of whether our goal is to gain size or strength. And we want to be able to sufficiently push ourselves near failure, but we don't want to push ourselves so far away from, or so much that we hamper our ability to recover. And that's why we've been talking about in the past few years, where people discuss the idea that maybe we shouldn't be going to momentary muscular failure every single set. And so a good rule of thumb, which we had mentioned before, was if you are experienced and proficient with the way that you move, I think that 1 to 2 reps is a good reps in reserve target to hit, because it tends to be, for me at least, the sweet spot for adaptations as well as considering recovery. And then strategically throwing in times where we go to momentary muscular failure based on where it is in the program, what we're trying to achieve, and what exercise it is. So
how would you program that for someone in an online environment who, let's say, is a year into weight training and you only get to see them online?
mm-hmm.
What would you do to, knowing that you're programming a 1 to 2 RAR, knowing the research and knowing they're probably not close to it? What would you do in that case?
So what I do personally is I coach people to be within 1 to 2 RIR in those situations. And we will do periodically intensity checks. And so what I have people do is, usually within a training block, I'll give somebody a month. I usually run 2 to 4 month training blocks where they use progressive overload over a cycle and improve on specific lifts week to week. And so I'll typically give them 1 month in that training. And then we'll come and we'll say, okay, you've been running this training for a month, which means you've had some time to adapt to it. You've had some time to test out different weights and kind of dial in where you think that 1 to 2 RIR is. And so we will spot target specific sets of specific lifts. And I'll say, okay, this week I want you to take this lift to momentary muscular failure on this set, and let's see where you end up. And if you need a spotter, certainly get a spotter, but I want you to take this to where you cannot possibly get another rep without failure in the middle of the rep. We're not going until complete technical failure. We're going until where that momentary muscular failure is. And that can often give them an idea of where they may be in that process. Because usually what I end up finding is, more often than not, they end up getting 3, 4, 5 reps farther than the RIR intended.
Oh, yeah.
And so this gives people that idea of, okay, if my guess was here and this is what it feels like to actually go to failure, over time, we're hoping that they start to learn, okay, this is the discomfort level that I experience when I'm actually pushing closer and closer to this reps in reserve. Because like you had mentioned, when you're working online, you have a little bit more of a difficulty in being able to gauge where your client is. When you're working in person, you can watch, okay, what is this person experiencing? Yeah. And that's where you start saying, hey, give me 2 more reps. But in an online environment, you don't quite have that same ability. And the farther that we move, the higher up in reps that we go, the ability to gauge this gets worse and worse. And so I find that testing this for 5 reps and below, people tend to be fairly accurate. As we get significantly above 5 reps, that's where all hell breaks loose. And you can be anywhere from, I remember a study by Richens in 2014 where they did something at 70% 1 rep max. And the study varied with the trainees, where they would get anywhere from 19 to 40 reps. So if the ranges are this big, we need to be focusing in on this in some way to be able to dial these people in. And particularly, as you mentioned, in an online setting, the hardest thing that you could possibly do here is being able to get a person there without actually seeing them in the moment. And so I think that these tests are probably the best way to do it, taking these targeted sets to failure and having them test that. And I would at least do that once a training cycle, if not twice. The other thing that you can have people do is have them tell them, okay, you can let me know when you want to test this, go into your gym or wherever it is, set up the support arms, take it to absolute failure, ask a spotter, take that to absolute failure. I've found that having the safety of a spotter itself is all that most people need to be able to bump out 3, 4, 5 more reps.
Oh yeah, that makes a huge difference, right? Neurologically, your brain is programmed for survival. So if it thinks you're gonna die or not make it, and I've had that in my own gym, even where it's okay, I know I'm in bench press or whatever, I know I'm in a cage, I know I'm fine, but that hesitation of the second where not so sure.
Am I going to get back up after this?
Yeah.
And so you can use that as a way to test yourself. And I really think that people tend to get a little bit shy about asking for a spot in a general gym.
Oh, yeah.
I've never seen anybody, one, say no, but two, people don't even, I've never noticed anybody feel like they've been put out by it. And as long as you offer to do the same for them, people are very happy to do this type of thing. Don't interrupt them in the middle of their set, but people do not have problems helping you out, particularly if you're pushing yourself. And I think that this is where we really need to go if we want to experience the progress that we're trying to shoot for. And I think that if you want the best return for your time in the gym, this is a critical skill to learn. And I think that a lot of people aren't even familiar with the fact that this is probably happening as much as it is. If it's in controlled research, if this is happening in what people deem trainees, like people that are resistance training experienced, what's happening to everybody else that's not necessarily as far along as those people. And so it's a big thing.
Yeah. Would you tell someone to go to momentary muscular failure, or would you tell them to go just shy of technical failure? Because one of the things I do worry about when I'm not watching some people is, we've all seen this example. Like, example I probably brought up on this podcast before is my buddy Adam and I, back when we were doing RKC stuff, they had the tactical strength challenge. All right, so for people not familiar, it's a 1RM max deadlift, it's a max pull-ups, and then the normal division for guys was as many snatches as you can with the 24 kg kettlebell. The elite division was 1RM deadlift, pull-ups with 25 pounds, I think, and then snatches with 32 kg. Doing 5 minutes of snatches with 32 kg is probably the worst thing I've ever done in my entire freaking life. But a buddy of ours came down from North Dakota. He's warming up doing the deadlift, and I think it was his first set. I think he started at 315. And then all of a sudden we look and the competition started, and he puts 455 on there, and it looked exactly like a pooping dog. And we're both watching this 5-second round back deadlift, and he made it, walked away, no injury. And both Adam and I looked at each other and we're like, that is both equally impressive and absolutely scary at the same time.
So this is an interesting topic because the body is amazing at adapting to stressors, right? And if he has trained in the past and that upper back has rounded, if you look at some of the best,
he hadn't, he just got lucky. But
he just survived
round back all the time.
So if this is a survival scenario, I wouldn't recommend doing that type of thing. But and so it depends on a couple things. One, how experienced is that person, and is this something that they experience when they go that heavy in general? There are some deadlifters who their upper back rounds significantly. And as long as it maintains that relative brace throughout the movement, it's not really that big of an issue. And as long as the lower back is relatively braced, it's not really that big of an issue. Yeah. The idea of textbook form has probably stopped more people from pushing intensity than anything else.
Yeah.
And so I would have a little bit more of a stance of momentary muscular failure for my bodybuilding trainees than I would necessarily for my guys that are competitive in sports. And that doesn't mean that you can't take things to technical failure. I think that taking things to technical failure can be fine if you're used to taking things to technical failure. Because and just like your example shows, when you start to get near like real failure, your technique starts to break down quite a bit. So my question would be, is this breaking down in an area where we should be really concerned about injury risk? Or is this those natural types of breakdown? Are we getting functional knee valgus in a squat, which tends to happen? And what's really funny is
coming in.
Yeah, and the Chinese actually teach that to their Olympic weightlifters, whereas
because you get torque out of it.
Yes, whereas it's this huge, like, forbidden thing in the West for some reason. We're slowly coming around. The bending of the upper spine, like you just mentioned in deadlift, is another one of those things. And so if I've got competitive sports trainees, I would say more, hey, let's get into this. With competitive bodybuilders, you almost don't need to go into that range quite as much. But to your point, the idea of perfect form is probably a myth to begin with. And a little bit of form breakdown is probably not that problematic. And it probably doesn't raise injury risk that much. Even when you look at the research to date on injuries, form is really low on the list of things that really raise injury risk. Sleep, how you're feeling mentally, the volume at which you're doing something all tend to come in way before perfect form comes into play.
Yeah. And on the deadlift, Constantine pulled, God, what did he pull? Close to 900, I think, with a rounded upper back.
He always rounds.
But he always rounds. If you watch the side view of him, it doesn't move under like superhuman loads. And so that's my argument. I agree with you that if you set in that position and you can hold that position the whole time,
you're fine.
I don't really think you have much risk. Where I get worried is people who like pull their shoulder blades back together. They're pulling 400 for the first time and their upper back goes at the top. I'm like, oh my God.
Yeah. So also, like I said, I 100% agree with you. And as well as, how are they doing from a training standpoint? Do they train with this slightly flexed position? The body is incredibly resilient. The spine is incredibly resilient. And just like we've vilified the knee valgus, the knee caving, when it's not necessarily a problem, we've been very scared for the past 20 or 30 years about spinal flexion. And I think a lot of that goes back to the original McGill research, because at the time it was probably the best that we had to go on. But the problem with it was that it was looking at spinal cadavers of pigs.
Yeah, the original stuff was. And then he did some follow-up work with ECG on strongmen and some other stuff like that. But the biomechanical modeling was early on pigs.
And the problem with that was, if you take a cadaver spine and you flex it 1,000 times, it breaks. It doesn't adapt. It doesn't adapt. And so his later research, and then particularly Lehman, who came after him, and McGill was part of his PhD. He was overseeing his PhD research. But Lehman's more recent research looks a lot better as far as that goes, because when you start to look at it as a functional human part of anatomy, you adapt so well. And Constantine is a great example of that. He's a guy that has been training progressively up in weight with that braced flex spine. And he doesn't seem to be at any more of an increased risk than anybody else. And this is one of those good fitness myths that you were talking about earlier.
Yeah.
That I think that people really get up in arms about. And I don't know if you know anything about my injury history. I broke my neck.
No, I don't.
I broke my neck 3 years ago.
Oh,
and I broke my neck. When people who lift weights get injured, it's always doing dumb crap, right? And so we had moved about 3.5 years ago. We made the final permanent move to Maui. And we had one of those pods, and we got them sent out. And so all of our stuff came in a pod a few weeks after we had been here. And I was gonna be Superman and do it all by myself and get it all done in one swoop. The problem was, the pod door opens, and then there's a lip that comes down from the roof of the pod. And so I was going in and I was picking up a couch by myself. I couldn't just pick it up and walk out. I had to pick it up, and then I bent my spine to get it under the lip and pull it out. Immediate pop, double spinal herniation, C4C pop. Now, the spinal flexion thing brings it up because for 6 months, I couldn't walk.
Oh,
And C4, C5 isn't one of those things where you're like, if the nerve is injured there, why couldn't you walk? The problem was it involved my right arm. And I don't think that people realize how much their arms move during locomotion.
oh
And
yeah.
so anytime I would walk anywhere and my right arm would swing, I would
Yep.
lose feeling in the right side of my body and
Oh,
intense shooting pains. And so I just didn't walk. I would get up and I would walk for 10 minutes at a time and a few times a day, and that was it because it's all I could handle. And when I was doing all my rehab stuff, I really started to get into Jefferson curls.
yeah, yeah. Explain a
And
Jefferson curl for people who that might be a new term.
sure. So Jefferson curls are, this is going to be a botched way to say this. Looking it up on YouTube will help you a lot, but this description will help too. When you are doing Jefferson curls, it is essentially a deadlift where you're accentuating the eccentric, the lowering phase with a rounded spine. You
Mm-hmm.
take it to end range of motion. Many times, if you've got really good mobility, maybe you stand on a box because you're holding a bar and you want the plates to be able to go as low as possible. And then you slowly reverse the motion out of flexion as you come back up. So we have this movement that is specifically focused on spinal flexion. And if the reality of the situation was the spinal flexion was something that was a major concern, this would be that exercise that would cripple everybody. But it ended up being something that was key to my rehab. And when I was first diagnosed with this injury, they did the MRI and all that. The first doctor looked at it and he said, you know what, you're never going to be able to lift again. And you know, it sucks for you. And I was like, that's not what I'm
Yeah.
looking for. And so I flew to Queens Medical Center, which is, for those that aren't familiar, it's on Oahu, it's in Honolulu, and it's the premier medical center for all of Hawaii. And I was able to talk with a neurosurgeon there who was experienced with working with NCAA Division I college football players. And he looked at it and he said, this is one of those injuries that if you have somebody that had no training history, you would look at and you would say, okay, that this could be lifelong debilitation. But I can tell you that having worked with athletes, you have a remarkable ability to recover. And one of the things that he had recommended after doing a few weeks of a few months of the rehab stuff was starting to get into some more Jefferson curls. And it saved me. I went from not being able to walk to gradually, you start really low. Like I said, you progress this up. You start with the bar or bumper plates that are like 10 pounds on each side. And then you
Yeah. Or
slowly
for some
progress
people, a
up.
dowel or a 15-pound
Sure.
aluminum bar.
Whatever you need to do that allows you to do this in a manner where you can progress up the weight over time. And I think that people get concerned about the injury risk with this type of stuff because they immediately throw on what they can conventional deadlift. And they're like, man, my back really hurts.
Yeah.
Yeah, of course it does. And
Yeah.
that progression really makes a huge difference in this type of thing. And yeah, I see the same thing with knee injuries. People always have a tendency to fearmonger leg extensions.
Yeah.
But I find that leg extensions are used pretty regularly in rehab scenarios, but you're gonna be focusing on the eccentric when you do it. In a lot of different ACL type injuries, people don't say, hey, you can never do this again. It's okay, let's modify this, let's progress this up slowly and take advantage of the isolation movement that it is.
Yeah. I would agree with that. And on Jefferson curls, I remember talking to Olympic coach for gymnasts, Christopher Summers, years ago about this. And he was saying, I could get the numbers wrong, but I want to say, he said, even his worst gymnast when he was a full-time coach could Jefferson curl at least their body weight. But I asked him, I said, how long did it take you to get them to do that? And he's 2 to 3 years.
Right. Yeah.
And these are elite level Olympic caliber athletes, right? But even then, it was years, not weeks, not months, years
Yeah.
to get to that point. And they did them like literally almost every training session.
So it's funny. The reason that I brought up Jefferson curls to the neurosurgeon was because my wife was a competitive Olympic lifter.
Oh,
And
interesting.
and in 2019, she went to Worlds and she got silver in Worlds for her
Nice.
weight class and held the American record in the snatch for her age group and weight at the time. And it's funny when I'll periodically do exercise demos for Instagram or our YouTube. And then whenever I write programs for people, we give a video demo so they can see it. And when I was doing it, I was like, you were much more flexible than me. You do the Jefferson curl demo and
Yeah.
I'll just narrate over top of it. Because if people see my type of mobility trying to do it, it's going to look really bad. But it's funny to see her do it as an experienced Olympic weightlifter who, like you said, apparently this is something that they've cued in on. They have a lot of spinal loading in the lifts that they do.
Oh, yeah.
And they've cued in on this decades before a lot of the other lifting modalities have. And it's a wonderful lift. And I think that anybody that's looking to bulletproof, I hate using that term, but bulletproof their injury risk for the rest of their lives, it's a wonderful lift to incorporate into your training. And maybe you don't need to do it on those days that you're like, okay, I've dedicated 3 or 4 days to building strength or maybe hypertrophy. Maybe you do it on like an off day that you're going to go in and do cardio, and then you use this as one of those skill type movements or injury risk reduction type movements if it fits into that programming.
Yeah, you can also even look at like the bench press if you're using kettlebells or a kettlebell windmill. Like the first time I saw those movements years ago, I was like, whoa, what the hell is that? That's a horrible movement. And then if you do it correctly, it actually feels pretty good. And I don't have any research on this, but I think the bottom position of a kettlebell windmill, if you think about actual spinal extension, whatever that looks like, I don't feel a lot of compressive load. I actually feel the opposite, which
Yeah.
is interesting. So a lot of times I think if you look at the Jefferson deadlift or a straddle deadlift, I've lost count of how many people I worked with who had back pain, who couldn't normal deadlift, couldn't conventional deadlift, even if their form was good. They could Jefferson deadlift though. Granted, light weights, that kind of place to start. And you look at that where you're straddle deadlift, you're rotated, you're like, this is stuff that gives Stu McGill nightmares. Most of them didn't have any back pain to do it. And so I'm like, yeah, just start light. They're like, what? I can't do that. I'm like, did you have any pain at all whatsoever? They're like, no. Okay, so what are you worried about? I'm not saying start at your max load for God's sake. Just start at 135 because your tissue is not ready for any loading in that area, and just see how it goes. And the people who did it, shocker, they got better. And what's cool is over time, not all the time, but half the time, I would say, their back pain went away and they could go back to conventional and sumo deadlift later, but not right away.
And part of that may be pain science is really interesting.
Oh yeah, it's such a swamp.
It's such a it's such a damn hole to get into. But pain science is really interesting. And one of the things that I think is really cool about what you brought up and how you're doing that with your clients or how you've done it with those people, a lot of the time, yes, there are benefits to those movements. And maybe I should have been doing more straddle deadlifts because that might have saved me from injuring myself in the pod when I switched my spine up.
Hard to say.
But I think what's really interesting about that type of thing is when you find that type of movement that is similar to some of those other things and you're able to do it without pain, I think it removes a lot of those expectation effects.
Oh,
which is a huge part of the experience of pain. What we expect is a big part of the how much we report we feel that level of pain, how much we report we experience that type of pain. And I tried to use that to my advantage when I was injured because I kept telling myself, this doesn't hurt. And I actually believed it. I was like, this should have healed 2 months ago. What's going on this entire time? But I think that one of the reasons that what you were putting into play probably worked was it showed them that they could get into these positions and that they could go through these movements and it doesn't have to hurt. And so relieving some of that tension and relieving some of those expectations on top of the fact that you're building up their soft tissue, you're building up supportive structures, you probably benefited them very significantly in that respect as well.
Yeah, with the pain stuff, like my little thing I tell clients is, or trainers even, it's okay. I don't expect you to be a pain scientist. I'm not expecting you to be a physical therapist. For God's sake, if you need to refer out, just please refer them out to a professional. Don't try to fix everything yourself. However, the simplest thing you can do is if they have any pain at all, just tell them not to do that exercise. One, it's a liability. Two, there's nothing really good that's going to come of it. If you have a mechanical issue, you're going to make it worse. If you have any neurological association with it, you're going to make it worse. And I would say 50% of the time, if you just avoid that, right? And these are people who are clear, they don't have a disc rupture, they can't find anything quote unquote wrong with them per se. 50% of the time, they just spend 2-3 months doing stuff that's not painful. They're good.
Yep. Fixes the entire problem.
Yeah. And you could argue then, did they have a true mechanical issue? Did they have their nociception got all crazy and central wind up and blah, 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 all this other stuff? It doesn't matter really. If they're better and they got out of pain and you covered yourself from a liability standpoint, like it's a win.
They're never going to figure that out anyways, because by the time that training cycle ends and they've done the Jefferson curls or straddle deadlifts or whatever it is, it's either that there's been enough time that your body has healed up, because what, 86% of lumbar spinal herniations spontaneously recover within 2 years anyways.
Yeah.
So these spinal injuries in particular, at least the lower back ones, I haven't seen any data on the upper, but at least the lower back ones, they're not a death sentence. And one of the worst things that you could possibly do is stop moving.
Yeah.
Motion is lotion, right? And so get in and get this stuff done and you'll be just fine.
And I'm sure you've seen the studies where they did, I think it was low back, they MRI'd a whole group of people. They sent them to radiologists to read, and they're like, hey, tell us what's going on with these people. I can't remember the exact stat, but I want to say it was something like 39% of the people, they came back and said, oh, you've got this disc rupture, you've got some abnormality on the MRI, you should have a lot of pain. What they didn't tell the radiologist reading it is that, hey, we just sent you all asymptomatic people. We just pulled people off the street and jammed them in an MRI who were all asymptomatic, had no symptoms at all. Mm-hmm. And you're like, holy crap.
Well, so my neurosurgeon actually brought up that exact fact when I was talking to him.
Yeah.
He goes, he said that if we went down your spine, everybody that lifts or plays a contact sport, your imaging is all screwed up. And so whenever we see this stuff, how much can we really understand by looking at this? They're like, we can give you broad strokes, but if you're not in pain, it's not a problem. And particularly with some of these bulging discs or exposed discs, sometimes it will naturally essentially resect itself and heal up. And a lot of times that's probably what's going on with these spontaneous healing situations. And it's just amazing to me that it's anywhere from about 66 to 86% that heal on their own. And if that's the case, great. I think that people have a tendency to give up and look at this as a lifelong sentence, when the right move is try to get back in and do what you can do. Like you said, avoid the things that are really problematic. And even when you look at the rehab research, it's not that you want to avoid pain entirely. Because when you bring rehab type movements that don't do this yourself, but go to a qualified physiotherapist, and when they come out with this is the plan, it seems that taking things just to the point of feeling a little bit of pain causes better overall recovery than being pain avoidant. Now, like you said, that doesn't mean find an exercise that causes you pain on literally every rep and then try to do that. But it does mean find something that you can do and bring it to your threshold, and then say, okay, I've done what I need to do.
Yeah. And that gets into the whole kind of threat inoculation. And do you make sure you're in a safe environment, make sure there's no mechanical damage, and make sure that there isn't any issue with it, because you're obviously working with a qualified professional. Yeah, I would agree in that circumstance. A little bit of pain, probably not that worried about it. But again, you're doing that, in my opinion, to reprogram your nervous system, right? You're doing it to say, okay, here's the threshold. So we're going to back off from there. Okay. And then we're going to go a little bit further, and then we're going to back off again. We're going to go a little bit further and back off. And then over time, you're increasing your amount of pain-free function. But unfortunately, as most meatheads go to the gym and they're like, oh yeah, this will be fine. And yeah. So that's why I usually just tell them, like, don't do anything that's painful.
So the problem is I fall into that category. And so when I was injured and I was like, man, this shouldn't be an injury, I should keep doing this, I was like, the pain expectation is not there. The pain just seems to exist still. So there's that, you find that healthy middle to where you're being smart about your training and you're taking things to the right point. And I think that when you get there, then you really start to see some good outcomes for these.
Yeah, I actually view when your body is functioning the best, if you make a wrong movement, you actually want a massive amount of blinding pain immediately to tell you made a wrong turn, so you stop doing it. And if you've ever had that and then you stop and do something else and it goes away, you're probably good, right? Because it, like, it's in the whole nociception and pain doesn't
Yeah.
actually mean you're damaged. It's your body predicting that if you keep doing this, some bad shit's going to happen to you. So we have this safety area, which again, people can definitely override and completely injure themselves, especially contact, high velocity, that type of stuff. But even just educating people that just because you have pain doesn't mean you actually have physical damage. It's like your body is trying to protect you from potential damage.
Yeah, that's how the whole stretching works too, right? Because most stretching is the benefits from most stretching exercises, or even things like lacrosse ball mobilization or those other things, are neural inhibition more than anything else. It's protective reflex.
Yeah,
And
which is
so just like you were
why I
talking
think
about,
static stretching is like probably the stupidest thing people can do.
it doesn't have it clinically, there's not a whole lot of apparent benefit to it. And it's probably the most over prescribed thing in all of fitness.
By far. Like most of the studies show, okay, yeah, like you did get a range of motion increase. Like you do the old school sit and reach test, right? They've done this twice now. And people are like, oh, but I did a static stretch for 60 seconds. And look, I can reach another half inch. It's like, you got that because you made your nervous system
Neural inhibition.
stupider.
Yeah. Neural
Right? You
inhibition.
inhibited the end range of motion because in the study, you're told to go to a discomfort of a 9 out of 10. So when you're stretching, you're desensitizing that area. So when you go to a 9 out of 10 again, you can go a little bit further. But to me, you made the muscle weaker. You're not stretching what you think you're stretching. And number 3, you actually made yourself stupider, so to speak. Like if you
You
look
wasted
at
your time.
accuracy at end range of motion, it's worse, not better. So anyway, I just think static stretching is like one of the stupidest things that's still around.
It's one of those, you were talking about the fitness myths that still are pervasive today.
Yeah.
It's one of the big ones. And it's funny because anytime you bring up the topic and you talk to a person that hasn't really looked into the research and you mention, hey, there's little to no backing that static stretching reduces injury risk.
Oh yeah.
And you cause an immediate visceral reaction from people. They hate hearing that. People hate hearing that they've spent hours and hours doing something that's probably not incredibly beneficial for the reason that they're doing it. And then they bring up the fact, I just want to be more mobile for whatever my lifts are. And then you bring up the fact that lifting end range of motion under weight is probably just as effective.
Way more effective, I would argue, if it's done correctly.
It's a much better use of time.
Oh, by far. Yeah.
Because you're experiencing a lot more adaptations. The studies that I can recall offhand suggested that it was on par with heavy static stretching. But the reality of the situation is heavy static stretching, even when you look at the amount of time that's needed, it's 5 minutes per muscle group per week in total.
Yeah. And that's on the low end. If you look at some of the stuff that actually resulted in potential tissue changes, some of those studies, you are holding lifts for positions for 3 to 5 minutes multiple times, 20 to 40-minute blocks. It's just stupid.
Yeah, I was saying that the 5 minutes per week split over a few sessions is what it was. One of the studies that I recall is 5 to 10 minutes split over multiple sessions for an entire week. Beyond that, you're not getting any other benefits for mobility. Yeah. Now, you're probably going to reach those same benefits just by lifting under load to end ranges of motion anyways. So not only are people probably doubling up on this mobility work when they're lifting and they're doing this type of stuff, but they're taking it far beyond where they actually need to go. Because if we can get this optimally done in about 5 minutes per muscle group per week without weightlifting in play, why are we spending 45 minutes 7 days a week before we even begin to lift a weight?
Oh, totally. And I would also even argue, what are you doing static stretching, right? People are like, oh, I'm doing a pectoralis stretch. Okay, so if we go with the standard thing that's told, okay, you got more range of motion by doing it because you made the muscle weaker at an end range. Last time I looked, almost all injuries occur at an end range. I don't want to be weaker at an end range. I want to be as strong as possible at an end range to reverse whatever external load was placed on me. And that doesn't guarantee you're not going to be injured. If you have a bigger load than what you can handle, of course you're going to get injured. But at least I want to hedge my bets towards that end of the spectrum, which you're back to again, lifting weights, full range of motion, trying to reverse motions again and increase strength.
Yeah, I think that people also place a little bit too high of a value on being extremely limber. And I say that because some muscle tightness is actually a beneficial thing, particularly when you're trying to generate force. And what you were referring to was
look at sprinters.
Essentially, yeah. Or this is a really bad one, but one of the studies that I remember was in power walkers. If they were way too lax, they were really bad at it. Yeah. But it's interesting because having laxity in musculature is exactly not what you want to do. And this is not an apt analogy, but it's one that I like to use with Gen Pop because it actually makes sense to a lot of people. When you stretch out taffy, like, does that seem like it would be a strong thing? And essentially, if you're taking a lot of time to static stretch before you go and lift weights, there's countless studies that show the performance decrements at least for 10 minutes after you've static stretched for a long period of time. Yeah. We static stretch for 45 minutes and then we have to wait 10 minutes before we can even start to do lifts. It would have just been nice if you did 3 sets of bench press at 50 to 60% weight until you were able to go.
Yeah. So the question then is, do you do anything indifferent? Do you do any neural activation things? Do you do mobility stuff? Do you just start with a light weight? What do you do?
So I think that a lot of this is overcomplicated, especially for the majority of people. And I think that dynamic stretching is perfectly fine. I think that warm-ups, the idea of warming up is good. So how do we do that in an efficient manner? And for some people, that's doing a dynamic stretching routine. That's what they like. For other people, it's literally just going in and doing some sets of whatever movements they're going to be doing at a lighter weight and progress up. And I have no problem with anybody choosing either of those as long as they feel comfortable with getting into the positions that they need to get into, that they're going to be working in. There's no reason that somebody needs to try to gain hypermobility just for the pure fact of gaining hypermobility. If you're a squatter and you can get to parallel or just below parallel, let's say that you're a power lifter and you can get just below parallel where you need to be called a good lift. I don't really find a benefit in people trying to take the time to be able to squat ass to grass for something that they don't necessarily need to do. Now, if your mobility comfortably allows you to get low, go to your end ranges of motion and do that.
Or your sport or whatever your goals require.
Yeah, whatever your goals are, certainly do that. But if you're asking, what do I have clients do? I give them in their programming a dynamic routine. And I actually split it. I have an upper dynamic routine, a lower dynamic routine. And I give instructions on how to blend them if we're doing a whole body day, if we're doing only an upper day, if we're doing a lower day, whatever it is. Or I give them the alternative of what I just said with, hey, if you're benching this day, if this day is, say we split it up more like a bodybuilder split, we're a hypertrophy focused person and the person's going to be doing chest and triceps or maybe a push day. Okay, we'll go in and do some sets of bench press. As long as you feel warm, able to go and able to get into the position that you want to be in, either thing works well for me. Do you have anything specific that you would do for neuromuscular excitation?
I've tried everything because I have a bunch of eye issues. I had a laundry list of injuries from pulled hamstrings to broken wrists, ankles, from mountain biking, kiteboarding, all sorts of crazy shit. Luckily, last 10, 12 years, I've been okay. I tried static stretching, foam rolling, joint mobility. I, at one point years ago, I literally was at the gym for an hour doing shit before I could lift a fraction of what I lift now. And again, I don't lift, I would say, super impressive weights or anything like that.
So this is a topic that hits home for you.
Oh yeah, because I tried everything. Long story short, the 3 things that helped me the most, I did get some benefit from some dynamic joint mobility stuff that did help a little bit. Mm-hmm. Going to a clinical neurologist to get my interaction between my eyes, my vestibular, my proprioception system figured out made a huge difference.
How do they do that?
In my case, I don't see real well in binocular. You've got 2 eyes, right? Yeah. The 2 eyes in humans are offset a little bit. Because of that offset position, they both send a signal to the visual part of the brain, which is in the back. And they have, imagine 2 images, 2 squares. But because your eyes are offset a little bit, the images are slightly different. And your brain will then fuse those images together and create 3D vision. In my case, when I was a kid, I had a lazy eye or a strabismus. So I had one eye that would just just disappear out somewhere else. When I was 4, they put a patch on the good eye to make my other eye track and do more work. And then my eyes tracked together. They said, hey, you're great. Don't worry about it. Mm-hmm. Never thought about it again until I tried to learn to drive a car and almost killed my parents, scared the shit out of them because I couldn't tell how far cars were coming towards me. As a kid, I hated ball sports. I just assumed some kids were not athletic and you just get hit in the face with balls. And I just thought that was me. I didn't know I couldn't see where the ball was, like literally couldn't see where it was. So fast forward to I was in my mid-20s, I did some training through Dr. Cobb, through Z Health, and they had a sports vision course. So I'm taking it, and they're doing all these tests, and everyone's like, whoa, your eyes are so crazy. The whole class, Dr. Cobb's over there, hey, test this guy's eyes. Look at this crazy shit that's going on. And I remember after a day of everyone like playing around with my visual system, like I was so roasted. Like I got up the next morning, I had a liter of coffee. I probably could have taken a nap in the corner of the room. Like, I know you can argue whatever CNS fatigue is in air quotes. Yeah. But if you've ever had that sensation where you just went in and did low rep training and your joints felt good, but you felt like you got hit by a truck, but you can't find anything quote unquote wrong with you. That's exactly what I felt like. I just felt like I could take a nap. I didn't have any other fatigue at all. So long story short, I realized he's asking me, he's like, have you had any visual issues? I said, oh, yeah, as a kid, I had a lazy eye, I had a strabismus. He's like, oh, okay. And so on a simple Brock string, I can't fuse any images together. So at that point, I realized, oh, and then I started thinking back, learning to drive a car, trying to learn to kiteboard, playing sports. What did I gravitate to? Weightlifting, so I can hold on to shit. I'm like,
proprioception instead of using the visual system.
Yeah, proprioception.
Yeah.
And so long story short, going forward, I actually ended up working through the Carrick Institute that does a clinical neurology. In all honesty, one of the main reasons I did that was I'm like, one, is just fascinating. 2, they're just awesome group of people. And 3, in my head, I'm like, if I ever get really stuck and I need help, I'm with all the nerds who can help me now. So I called one of the guys here, did a couple sessions, ended up doing a whole week of like basically neural rehab where you come in 3 times a day, they work on stuff. And the short version is, in my case at that point, they have these goggles they can put on and they can look at how your eyes move with no light. They use an infrared camera. And in my case, my eyes were doing this really hyper fast, like torquing motion under basically no stimulus, which they shouldn't do, right? Your eyes should be in the middle of your head.
Yeah.
And so I think you're getting an error from your vestibular system is firing into that part of your brain, telling you that you tilted your head, but you didn't tilt your head, right? Because when you tilt your head, your eyes will torque the opposite direction to stay in the middle of your head. And so I think you need more vestibular balance in your ear work. Long story short, we did that for a whole week, remeasured me at the end of the week on Friday, and my eyes actually stopped torquing. HRV went up, resting heart rate went down. I wasn't able to entirely see in 3D, but when I would do jumps like kiteboarding, I could now tell when I was coming down. Or there's also an otolith function in the vestibular system that'll tell basically rapid height differences. If you were to close your eyes and go in an elevator and drop real fast, it can detect those changes. Yeah, so anyway, I got quite a bit better doing all that kind of stuff. So long story to shape how this goes back to all my movement issues, I ended up doing some stuff through Be Activated, which is through Doug Heel out of South Africa, which they later repurposed as RPR, Reflexive Performance Reset. And that made like a huge difference. So the first time Doug reset my eyes, quick story. So we're at this training, and so Cal Dietz convinced me to do this. I was doing my PhD at the University of Minnesota. Cal was next door all the time, so he would come over to the lab and we would harass each other all the time. So he comes over in the lab one day and he's like, hey man, I got this guy from South Africa. He's coming in to do this cert for $1,500. You got to go to this thing. And I'm like, what are you talking about? I wouldn't want to pay some guy from South Africa $1,500. What is this? He's like, crazy shit, man. Crazy shit. And I'm like, okay, sure, whatever. If it was anybody else on the face of the planet, I'd be like, screw you. I'm not giving you $1,500, whatever.
Yeah.
So I go to the cert. Doug Heel was doing Be Activated training. Get to day 2, do the visual stuff. So he's okay. Anyone here have visual issues? So like Cal's pointing to me. I raise my hand. I go up there. And basically they do, if you're familiar with AK, so AK testing, where they're just doing muscle testing and they're having you look far away, do all these different visual tasks. And so every time I do any visual task, like I just go weak. And he's like, close your eyes. So the second I close my eyes, like everything works better. And he goes, oh, you're a functional 0. I'm like, functional
Thanks.
0? We only learned about 1, 2, and 3 this whole weekend. You get better by cutting your visual field. That's not how the body should work. Go sit back down. And I'm like, go sit back down. I'm like, aren't you supposed to fix me? I'm standing here in front of the whole class. And he looks at me and he goes, you're so fucked up. I don't know if I can help you. So go sit down, work with somebody else first. The other guy goes up, goes through a bunch of visual stuff, brings me back up, and they basically reset my vision. So he had me play catch with a ball with little letters on it. And I had trained myself at that point to be able to do it, but it was very a conscious, competent thing. So after they did a bunch of stuff, they reset my eye position. I could literally jump and catch a ball and see all the letters of it coming in. And literally up until that point, I had some prism glasses from PRI, from Ron Hruska, Postural Restoration Institute. And those helped with my movement because they would adjust the visual field to make it more even. And then since I got adjusted by Doug, the prism glasses, every single time I put them on, they fucked me up.
That's
which
actually
to a normal person is what they should do.
Right. That's actually probably a good sign.
Yeah, so it was a good sign. So I actually never had to wear prism glasses again. So all that long story short to say, I found that the RPR, just doing the self-targets on yourself, even without the visual stuff, makes like a huge difference. I've even had lifting, I've tested velocity, I've tested HRV, I've tested resting heart rate, I've tested metabolic stuff. And I don't know, man, like all of it on people definitely seems to get better. And everything just feels easier and feels like it's working the way that it should. I could go under a load and do a slow grinding lift most of the time and know that it felt good. Where previous to that, I would never do that. I felt like I was just going to destroy myself in the process. So I basically do RPR.
Do you have, is this always stuff that's done pre-workout or do you do this in off time?
Yeah, it's a good question. Normally I do it before lifting because if you think about stress, so stress is going to imprint stuff faster, for better or worse. So trauma is basically an extremely high stress event that imprints certain things on you. There's also post-traumatic growth, which can happen from high stress events, not necessarily PTSD. But so lifting is going to be a higher stress thing. So I'll do it before lifting because I want to help imprint the better movement patterns. Sometimes I'll do it before sleep. Sometimes I'll do it on my off days if I've just been sitting too much or that type of thing. So there's different times you can do it, but generally lifting, but I have done it at other times. Last part on that, if you want to get really crazy down an interesting rabbit hole, you can do it in between your lifts. And what I've noticed, and Cal talked about this too, Cal Dietz, you don't see nearly the degradation in rep count that you would otherwise. If you have a decent aerobic base, you're not, even if you go to failure, like the amount of drop off you see isn't nearly as profound, which is crazy.
How much are you spending as far as your rest periods?
I used to do all sorts of calculated rest periods, and then probably 5 years ago, I just went with the biometric method.
Yeah.
So I'll wear a heart rate.
So are you monitoring, heart rate, HRV?
Yep. And if it's a main heavy technical lift, I'll wait till my heart rate probably gets 85. If it's an accessory lift or something like a pec deck, 100, 110, like I don't worry too much about it at that point.
I'd be interested to see because most of the stuff that's out for exercise science, they do it by time, right?
Yep.
I'd be interested to see your rest periods, to see how long, if you were to time them, to see how long it would take you to get down to say 85 beats per minute in those compound lifts, because I would be interested to see if that translates to the 3 to 5 or so general minutes that they recommend between strength work versus
I can tell you it's way less.
Way less.
So if my aerobic system is better, which it is now, like I just did a session today, I alternated between doubles on bench press and triples on a axle deadlift. And I did another accessory lift with that. So the axle, I did 8 sets, I think.
So you supersetting?
Yeah, supersetting in probably 45 minutes total time. So I'd say most of the time when I start out, it's 1 to 2 minutes, but then it'll get progressively longer. And then at some point, I'll find it just goes off a cliff. So I'll just stop at that point.
That's a good guideline for when you're
Yeah.
finished with your training. If we're going to be looking at fatigability, maybe that's the point where you say, okay, I'm going to be doing more. I hate the term junk volume because it's not entirely accurate,
Yeah.
but in essence, I may be doing essentially more junk than highly effective sets.
Yeah. And so here's an example. Like I did a single, double, triple, 4, and then 5 reps on the axle.
Mm-hmm.
And that was at 255, double overhand, so 2-inch thick. And I said, okay, that's pretty good. I got 5. That's a PR. So I'm going to go up to 275. So I go up 275, hit an easy single. But then after that, I only got a half rep the next time and thought, okay, I just haven't rested long enough. So I rested 8 minutes. I barely got air with it at that point. So I said, okay, I'm probably done. I did 23 reps before I got to that point.
Yeah.
So I generally find like it'll go up, it'll do good, it'll plateau, and then at some point it just goes off a cliff. And yeah, so I try to stop right before that point. But sometimes like today, I just test it to see, did I find it or not?
So I like the idea. I'm interested to see more of the HRV stuff as that comes out over the years. I'm also interested to see how bar speed measurement may play in
stuff.
Yeah, I like the velocity based stuff. Not that we're really we don't know a whole lot yet. At least I don't see, based on the research that's out there, that we know a whole lot or how to practically use this. But I think that's one of those potentially very beneficial avenues of research to see how can we start to monitor these things and then adjust programs accordingly, because I think that you're going to start to notice trends with velocity and fatigability, and how is that laying out as far as where am I going to be able to take this, and at what point should I probably start to think, okay, my day is done because progress is going in the shitter.
Yeah, and Brian Mann's got some pretty good stuff on that. And I would say, based on his work and just a little bit of me playing around with it, we've got a pretty good idea for main performance lifts. The caveat there being the goal is rep speed. So with Dr. Ben House, we played around with in Costa Rica trying to figure out if you're doing meathead hypertrophy type training, is velocity useful? And we're basically
not as much.
Even if you try to map it to an individual, you could make an argument that you do the inverse. You literally go to the point where you just are grinding out a rep at an incredibly slow pace, because that's probably a pretty good marker of fatigue, or you're right next to failure. But again, that's extremely individual variable. Some people can grind through stuff pretty good. Other things, like my buddy Serby, like he would hit, and I'm similar this way, my end reps sometimes for speed look almost the same as they were before. I just go good, whoop, off of. Not
That's what I do.
Yeah. But in general, like on a deadlift, like on a trap bar deadlift, I can grind something out. On a normal deadlift, no, it's either there or it's not. And
yeah,
I don't know. Maybe people are just wired differently. I don't know.
I have a tendency to perform the same way that you do. I look extremely good. Like I'll be benching or squatting or whatever it is, and I'll look extremely good. And the guy will be like, "You've got 2 left." I'm like, "No, I don't."
Yeah,
I can feel it coming. And it's, for most people, I find that it's not quite as dramatic as what my drop offs look like, but I look really good for this really heavy weight. And then you can tell, hey, if I go down another time, I'm not coming back up.
Yeah.
How much do you want to spot this?
Yeah, and it's even crazy with grip stuff too, because you'll add like half a pound sometimes on lifts and it'll just stay glued to the floor, where you just did it before, like no problem. So it's just weird how some stuff, and that's probably more of a neurologic thing than anything else, the curves are completely different for everything too.
Yeah. So one other thing that I wanted to mention, since we had talked about the people's ability to gauge how close they are to failure, getting that into the right spot. I think that the other thing that's really important, and the other side of that coin, is actually monitoring your progress and seeing, how do we know whether or not we're moving in the right direction? Because once you're outside of that beginner stage where you can see progress very distinctly, okay, then what do we use as our guide for actually progressing in the intermediate and beyond stages. And this is going to be something that I would love to see what you do with yourself and your clients, because I think that every coach, I don't think that this is standardized. And I think that every coach has their own ways to do this. And what I like to do is monitor four things: perceived exertion, soreness and fatigue, performance, and actually pumps. And I think that these things, each one of these things as an individual data point, probably isn't a great indicator of whether or not you're progressing or not, but all of them together can give you a more complete picture. And what I look for with that is, for the first one, perceived exertion, I like to push the difference that we were talking about before, that warm-up sets and working sets are distinctly different.
Oh, yeah.
And if you aren't struggling by the end of even your very first set, it's probably still a warm-up.
Yeah.
I think that when people are given 5 sets, I think that in the majority of the time, those first 2 sets that they do are probably still warm-ups, because they're like, yeah, I got that. That was pretty good. You were probably 5-6 reps off of failure. And that's it. In the intermediate stage and beyond, that's just too far away for that to be a working set. Then soreness and fatigue. I look for signs of modest post-exercise soreness or fatigue in muscles that tend to get sore, in those people that tend to get that. Not all muscles get the same type of soreness or fatigue, even for each person. So it's not a definitive sign of progress, but something that can be monitored if you notice that you have that tendency. And also obviously watching out for extreme cases of soreness and fatigue from workouts, because that's usually a sign that it's probably time to dial back some of that volume if we're really digging into recoverability from those movements. For performance, I tell people to look for at least progress being maintained or slow progress over time. And the more experience that you get, obviously, the slower that's going to go. Being in a calorie surplus, you're obviously going to go a lot faster. And sometimes in a calorie deficit, depending on how experienced you are, holding steady might be the right expectation. It just really depends on where you are. But I think that once we start to get, even for physique athletes, once we start to get into that intermediate and beyond stages, focusing on performance and how that's working is probably a much better indicator than anything that you can get from the scale, the mirror, because the reality of the situation is adding lean muscle is a painfully slow process. So what do we look at to give us some insight into what we're doing is working? And I think that this is probably the number one. And then last thing, and the one that's probably the most controversial, is the residual pump from training. Now, this to me is similar engaging soreness, in that individuals may not have this significantly in certain musculature. Some may have it more in some muscles than others. Obviously, you're going to have it more if you do more eccentric focused training. But as long as you realize this, you can monitor that and see, okay, and the longer that you go into a training cycle, obviously, the more that alleviates. But if you know that you have musculature that tends to get sore, particularly in the beginning of training cycles, you can look at that and say, okay, am I getting the same type of stimulus that I've gotten in the past? And how does this add into those other points that we've been looking at? And I think that, as I mentioned, every coach has a different set of these things. But I think that if you use a variety of them, it can give you a better picture of where you are and where you're going, and can get people comfortable with that process and being patient with where you're moving. Because like we've said before, building strength, building a physique, after that beginner stage, you start to get into that grind, and you hopefully are training because you enjoy parts of the process, you enjoy what it's giving you. But if outcome-based goals are part of your process, then you need to find different ways to be able to look at that and objectively tell, okay, where am I going and what do I need to do to make adjustments? So that's what I use. What do you typically look at?
Yeah, I'm like huge on output, even for physique athletes I've coached, because like you said, if you are physically doing more, like more volume, more density, higher percentage of 1 rep max, so you're stronger, at some point you have to add muscle, unless you're just in a crazy caloric deficit, right? Even if you're in a caloric deficit, you can probably still add some muscle.
Right.
It's very hard to measure 1/4 inch increase in your bicep. Yeah, you can do circumference measurements and all that stuff. I think is useful. So for most people, I just am a stickler on performance. So I'm gonna look at volume. over time, can you do more volume than you've ever done before? And that's exercise specific. Can you do more density? So with advanced people, I'll record, okay, you've got a block of time. Okay, you're going to do 5 sets, Bill Star 5x5. How long did it take you to complete all 5 sets? Cool, it took you 25 minutes. Great. Next week, we're going to leave everything the same, but I want you to get just maybe 5 to 7% better on density. So if you did the same amount of work in 24 minutes, cool, you're better.
Awesome.
And then percentage of 1 rep max. So can you lift a heavier load? This could be a heavier 5 rep max, 8 rep max, whatever. And for neurotic people like myself, I have a notebook with like my top lifts that I'm working on. And I literally record volume, density, and intensity. And the thing that I found is most useful is if I'm hitting more volume, let's say on axle deadlift, because that's what I was doing today. I know at some point my 1RM, which is my main goal, has to go up. Right. So like today I did 5 reps with 255. I got 275. My max was 280 is my 1 rep max all time. So my next goal is to hit 285. I know because the other day I did 265 for 16. Was it, I think 16 reps. So for each load, I have the max amount that I've done. And for 1 week to the next, it may literally be only doing 1 or 2 more reps. I don't even care if I do more sets, right? Because my goal is, can I accumulate more high quality volume at that load or just total in time?
Even 1 or 2 more reps in a week's time period, given a trained individual, that's big.
Yeah. And I know that if I keep pushing that and my body is able to do it, that my 1RM will go up. Because I think what one of the myths too is that everyone gets stuck in the DeLorme 3x10 method that's been around for 7 decades now. And people look at my training and they're like, wait a minute. So you took 60 minutes the other day and just did 2 lifts and you did 11 sets of each? I'm like, yeah, because I got 2 more reps of them than I did the week before.
But progress is progress.
Yeah, and they're like, what the hell's wrong with you? I'm like, I remember talking to my buddy Adam Glass, who helps coach me with grip stuff. And I asked him once, we were laughing about the grip sport because people get into all these little weird things and this variety for the sake of variety, which is fine if you like it. You do you.
Yeah.
And I asked him, I
said, so that's the difference with that is, and this is the way that I look at that. That's exercising versus training, which is a bit more regimented. Now that's
totally.
It's semantics at its core, but that's how I define those two things. And if the most important thing is that people are getting out and doing something, right? So if that's what you need to do to stay entertained, great. But there is a difference between regimented training where you're controlling certain variables and then trying to push other variables forward versus throw random shit at you.
Totally. Yeah. And if people like doing that for variety and novelty is their number one thing, not progress, cool. Great, man. It's better than doing nothing.
Yeah.
And I remember asking Adam once, I said, hey, so you're telling me the secret is pick the top lifts for grip that have the highest load with the highest transfer and then work to get better at volume, density, and intensity on them for years at a time. And he looks at me and he's, yes. And he's because I can go out to the gym and play with an axle bar for an hour and a half because my autistic ass enjoys this.
Yeah. It's funny if you look at the guys that are either really good in a weight training sport or are very accomplished in a physique sport, there's never anything it's always mastering the basics over extended periods of time without loss of enthusiasm. So I think it's really funny when you talk about getting in there and being like semi-autistic or just you get so neurotic about your focus on this type of thing. But I think that the people that are really successful really do hyper focus on, okay, I'm going to get comfortable with this process. And then the joy of this is consistently challenging myself. It's you against you. And how do you set that up? And one of the ways to do it is intensity, density, volume. You could do it load. Like it's fun. And I think that the people that struggle a bit, who get caught, they go through that beginner stage and then they get caught in the intermediate stage, is that they don't realize that the joy is in the mastering the basics.
Oh yeah. Yeah. And just being able to do it. And even for grip stuff, like most people I coach, like they don't do the same thing I do because they don't have the same goals. They're not trying to pick up an inch dumbbell. So they just want grip to transfer to their sport. Great. You don't need to do nearly as much. Mm-hmm. But you look at Olympic weightlifters, right? Shit, how many times a day are they training? I don't even know of any high-level Olympic weightlifter that trains a half hour a day, right? You got extremes from the Chinese system to the Bulgarian system and everything in between. But at some point, you just have to do more work. And yes, you have to keep the quality of work high. Right. But at some point, more is better. Till it's not.
till it isn't. And so that's why you look at the 4 things that, at least for me, that's why my clients look at the 4 things that we talked about. Or if anything that you're going to hyper focus on is look at your soreness and fatigue and see, okay, maybe we expect fatigue to accumulate over an entire training block. If it's a 3 or 4 month training block or whatever it is, maybe we expect fatigue to accumulate, and that would be probably a realistic expectation. How is our performance improving? And if you're at least monitoring those 2, you're keeping your eye on the most important things to, 1, be able to adjust your programming in the middle of a training block, but 2, to give yourself some comfort in knowing that I can't continually get stronger and stronger or increase my density or volume or whatever it is and not have progress in different areas.
Yeah.
And again, the biggest issue for the majority of people is you get spoiled with those beginner gains because you see massive progress every week. Oh, I went up 10 pounds in a lift. I can't tell you the last time that I went up 10 pounds in a lift.
Yeah.
Like maybe a massive compound lift, like a deadlift. Yeah. But I can't tell you the last time that I went up 10 pounds in anything other than a massive compound lift. And even in those, advanced trainees know that those 1.25 and 2.5 pound change plates are the heaviest plates in the gym.
Oh yeah.
Eventually,
especially when you're doing less stuff too. I'm doing an axle. If I can add 15 pounds to my axle a year, I'm incredibly stoked. Yeah. Saxon bar, if I can add 12 pounds to my Saxon bar a year, great. It's and over time, like you said, then you have the thing of getting older where you're just, at some point, not that I'm that old, but it's just going to be about trying not to go backwards.
there is that, you start to see that decline in like your 40s. I'm in my 40s now.
Yeah, that's what everyone tells me, but I just turned 49.
Yeah.
And
so you're not that much older than me. I'm 42.
Yeah. All my lifts now, the ones that I train, are better than they've ever been.
Here's been my experience. When I was in my 20s, I could fall off a roof and I was ready to lift the next day. Now, if I sleep wrong, I'm out for a week. But if I manage my volume, if I train intelligently, I still progress rather well. And I think that we can certainly continue to see progress, gains, all those things for many decades. And to your point, where people say, oh, you're going to start seeing these massive let-offs. Even if you do, maintenance throughout all of these decades is going to be far more important than anything else.
Oh, yeah.
The quality of life difference that you have in your late 60s, 70s from a lifetime of progressive training versus never really getting into it, it's massive.
Yeah, and to me, the process doesn't change. It's a variable that I can't necessarily control, which is the output. Like, I can control the inputs, my sleep, what I do for training, all that kind of stuff. But if at some point it starts to flatten out just purely due to age, the reality is I'm probably going to do the same process unless I have a lot of pain or a high cost or goofy HRV or something weird happens. Yeah. Like, I'm literally going to try to do the same process. So it doesn't, I think people get too wrapped up in thinking that they have to completely change everything. And if anything else, I've actually probably dedicated more time to lifting. Like, I've been trying to set up my schedule so 3 days a week I can lift with just however long I want. I just go until it goes off a cliff and then I'm done.
That's the right way to look at it. And again, if you can maintain this and go into those further decades in high quality life, that's the right move.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for all your time. I really appreciate it. And I know you put a lot of stuff online, and Tell us where they can find you, if it's in-person stuff or online stuff. Where's the best locations?
The best thing that you can do is head over to mauiathletics.com, MAUI, or hit me up on Instagram, Dr. Dr. Allan, Allan Bacon on Instagram. If you have any questions, certainly send me a message. I'm more than happy to help out there.
And do you train people in person, or is it just online?
Exclusively online at this point.
Okay, cool.
Living out in Maui, being in the middle of the Pacific makes it hard to find a whole lot of in-person clientele, and online tends to work really well for me. And I've been exclusively online for a few years now. Luckily, I was online prior to the whole COVID situation. It was just a smooth time through that. And like we were talking about before the show started, I expected that COVID period to be a big drop off.
Oh, yeah.
People seem to be very dedicated, and it was wonderful to see.
Yeah, like my highest income year was, for better or worse, the year of COVID.
I think
because I didn't do anything but work. So
people had more time, and so they're like, I don't have anything else to do. May as well start watching what I eat and working out at home.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate all your time. That was great.
Cool. Thanks so much, Mike. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you so much for listening to the podcast today. Really appreciate it. Huge thanks to Dr. Allan Bacon for all of his time, and really enjoyed the conversation there. Excited to see him in person next year at the Coaches Summit, which will be great. And thank you for listening. I really appreciate everyone who tuned in and made it all the way to the end, or even part of it. You can get more information from me and other podcasts at miketnelson.com/podcast. You can scroll down. There'll be a way to get onto the newsletter for even more information delivered directly to your inbox. Try to keep them in infotainment as best as possible. Information, primarily research-based information, but in a way that you can understand and hopefully get a few chuckles as you read it. Again, thanks to Dr. Allan Bacon. Check out all of his stuff. We've got all of his links and everything here. Great stuff from him as always. Thank you for listening to the podcast. Really appreciate it. And stay tuned for another episode next week. Thank you so much.
You know something? That was a sweet number.
It sure was.
You know something else?
What?
I hate sweet numbers.
This podcast is for informational purposes only. The podcast is not intended as a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. You should not use the information on the podcast for diagnosing or treating a health problem or disease, or prescribing any medication or other treatment. Always seek the advice of your physician or other qualified health provider before taking any medication or nutritional supplement, and with any questions you may have regarding a medical condition. Never disregard professional medical advice or delay in seeking it because of something you have heard on this or any other podcast. Reliance on the podcast is solely at your own risk. Information provided on the podcast does not create a doctor-patient relationship between you and any of the health professionals affiliated with our podcast. Information and statements regarding dietary supplements are not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease. Opinions of guests are their own, and this podcast does not endorse or accept responsibility for statements made by guests. This podcast does not make any representations or warranties about guest qualifications or credibility. Individuals on this podcast may have a direct or indirect financial interest in products or services referred to therein. If you think you have a medical problem, consult a licensed physician